Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Wake Forest, North Carolina. Early evening, September 30th, 2025. Patrol cars roll into the 5500 block of Mill Dam Road, a quiet residential stretch just off Winter Jasmine Lane. The address comes through a neighbor's breathless call to 911 reporting shots from inside a single-family home. Officers arrive within minutes. One woman, approximately 40, is carried out by EMS with multiple gunshot wounds and transported. The house is taped, the block is calmed, and the command post is set a few doors down. From the outset, law enforcement labels it what it appears to be, an isolated domestic incident. No wider threat is announced. The work turns inward, to one house, one set of rooms, one sequence of events. This is not a sprawling manhunt or mystery with shifting scenes. The scene is here. Investigators hold the doorway and initiate the evidence log. Inside, the search follows a standard order: secure, clear, note transient conditions, then begin the slow documentation: overall photos, mid-range, close-ups, measurements, markers. Every step is designed to reconstruct a timeline that no longer has a voice to tell it. The woman rushed from the residence will later be pronounced at the hospital. Her name is Josefina Tavares, 40 years old. She lived here. She did not leave under her own power. Neighbors provide the first fragments of time, a raised argument that grew sharper as daylight faded, the sudden crack of gunfire, the silence that followed. Officers take one adult male from the immediate area into custody. He is described only as the woman's partner and a resident of the address. No bond is set tonight. This is standard in a fatal shooting under a domestic violence frame: contain first, charge decisions after the initial interviews, preserve the integrity of the scene. From curb to living room, the evidence is handled like a closed loop. Casings, if present, are gridded and flagged, not scooped. Trajectory work begins with the obvious and moves to the subtle: wall impacts, angles, the relation between line of fire and likely shooter position. If a firearm is recovered, it's photographed in place before anyone touches it. If it isn't, that absence is documented with equal care. Blood evidence is noted for pattern, volume, and directionality, but not interpreted beyond what the patterns can support. A medical examiner's findings will later fix the manner of death. Tonight, investigators work with what they can see, measure, and preserve. Wake Forest is not a city that expects headlines like this. In towns like Wake Forest, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The first public statement is careful: one person in custody, no ongoing danger, investigation active. That caution isn't spin, it's procedure. In a domestic homicide, speculation is a shortcut that breaks cases. The cleanest path is linear: establish the timeline, stabilize the chain of custody, and let the physical record lead. From the radios to the report forms, the case is already narrowing to a single address and a narrow window of time. The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Josefina Tavares was 40 years old and, according to investigators, she lived at the Mill Dam Road residence where this case begins and ends. In a domestic homicide inquiry, victimology is not biography for its own sake. It is a structured profile that tells detectives what to verify first: residence, relationships, recent stressors, and any documented safety concerns. On September 30th, 2025, those checks started quickly. Officers confirmed identity through standard records and medical coordination. They established that Josefina resided at the address and was in a relationship with the adult male detained that night. That single fact, cohabitation, defines how the rest of the investigation is framed: one house, one intimate partnership, one critical window of time. The goal here is accuracy, not speculation. Detectives begin with what can be proved on paper and through direct contacts. Residence is corroborated by routine documentation tied to the location and by people who knew the couple lived there. Relationship status is fixed by statements to police and the very circumstances of the call. From there, the team outlines a clean list of verification tasks: confirm any prior calls for service at the address, check for recent court filings relevant to the couple, and determine whether outside agencies hold protective orders or similar records. If nothing is on file, that is noted. If something exists, it is routed to the case agent and logged. Either way, the finding is useful. It narrows the field and keeps the narrative from drifting into assumptions. When a case is classified as a domestic, it is standard to ask who last saw the victim well and whether that person is the same individual who was present when the injury occurred. Those answers matter because they anchor the timeline before forensic results return. In this case, the narrow window is already established by the response time to 911 and the removal of Josefina from her home. That window guides interviews, nearby residents, anyone who had regular contact with her, and any person with a reason to know her movements on the afternoon and evening of September 30th. The purpose is not to crowd the story with anecdotes. The purpose is to find corroborated timestamps that align with physical evidence logged inside the home. Humanizing a victim does not require dramatic language. It requires respect and precision. Josefina is not reduced to what happened to her. She is identified accurately, placed in context, and treated as the central figure whose last hours must be reconstructed without embellishment. That means saying what we know and stopping where public information ends. Newsroom-style restraint helps the investigation and helps the audience understand why the tone is steady. A disciplined approach keeps rumors out and keeps the focus on what the case can prove. Domestic violence awareness is not a storyline, it is a safety lens. In North Carolina in late September 2025, authorities and advocates were already warning about lethal outcomes in intimate settings. Bringing that context into this chapter is not a moral lesson, it is an investigative reality check. If a homicide stems from a domestic dispute, then the critical questions are confined to the home and the people in it. Did anyone else have access? Was there a third party? As of this stage, officials called the incident isolated and did not warn of a wider threat. That matters because it narrows investigative hypotheses and keeps the audience clear on scope. This is one residence, not a series of locations. The medical component is equally straightforward. A hospital pronouncement and a handoff to the medical examiner transition the case from emergency care to evidence-supported cause and manner of death. Multiple gunshot wounds is not a flourish, it is the current factual description pending final documentation. The examiner's later report will lock details that are not public tonight. Until then, responsible narration states only what is confirmed and leaves room for formal findings. Facts first, interpretation later. That makes the story cleaner and the case stronger. From a production standpoint, holding to this structure protects coherence. We have a clearly identified victim, a confirmed cohabiting relationship, a single address, and a narrow window. Each element supports the next step without repeating the last. The narrative is not built on mood, it is built on verifications that can stand in court and make sense to viewers. When a story is told this way, it keeps attention not by raising the volume but by raising the reliability of every claim. If you are watching, you should feel that each detail arrives because it has been checked, not because it fills time. Before we move on, note the investigative posture. Any claim made by any party will be tested against records, timestamps, and physical evidence. That is the only fair method for the victim and the only credible method for the audience. The cleaner the inputs, the clearer the outcome. In a town like Wake Forest, clarity honors the person at the center of this case and supports the community that woke up to a fatal shooting in their neighborhood. The clock on a domestic homicide starts tight and moves outward. For this case, the first anchor is early evening, September 30th, 2025. A neighbor reports gunfire from the Mill Dam Road address. Units arrive within minutes. EMS transports a 40-year-old woman. The residence is secured. From there, investigators build a linear chain that can be checked and rechecked. They log dispatch times, arrival times, transport times, and the hospital pronouncement. Those are the fixed points. Everything else, witness accounts, device activity, exterior cameras, has to reconcile against those anchors or it doesn't make the cut. Door-to-door canvassing begins as soon as the perimeter is stable. Neighbors are asked for a simple set of facts: what they heard, when they heard it, and whether they saw anyone enter or leave the driveway in the hour before police lights filled the block. No one is pressed for theories. The point is to find the earliest corroborated minute that signals escalation inside the home. When residents note raised voices that taper into a short burst of shots, those statements are logged with approximate times and cross-referenced against the dispatcher's timestamps. When two clocks line up, civilian memory and system time, detectives have a tighter lane to drive evidence through. At almost the same moment, a parallel track starts with technology. If there are exterior doorbell cameras on the street, officers request downloads. If there are municipal or neighborhood cameras, they flag the windows that matter, prior to the gunfire and the minutes after. The search is limited and specific. They're not chasing a mystery car around town, they are confirming the absence or presence of movement tied to that one driveway. Inside the home, any electronic devices that fall within consent or warrant scope are isolated to preserve potential logs, calls made, messages sent, a device that remains stationary when it shouldn't have. None of this is dramatic. It's routine, and routine wins cases. By the time midnight passes, the first appearance paperwork is already in motion. The adult male detained at or near the scene is held without bond pending formal charging. Meanwhile, the victim, now identified as Josefina Tavares, is formally pronounced at the hospital and the handoff to the medical examiner is scheduled. Multiple gunshot wounds becomes part of the working record. That single phrase does a lot of timeline work. It tells detectives they're looking for clustered gunfire, not a single accidental discharge. It tells prosecutors the narrative will be measured by intent elements, not just opportunity, and it tells the audience why investigators treat this as a focused domestic case rather than a broad public threat. Morning brings second pass interviews. People are steadier after a night's sleep, and details often sharpen. A delivery driver may remember a parked car that wasn't usually there, or a neighbor might correct a time by comparing it to a TV program they were watching when the argument started. Detectives aren't building a mood, they're sanding down rough edges until the minute-by-minute makes sense without the victim's voice. If any claim surfaces that doesn't fit the known window, someone saying the argument started much earlier, or that a vehicle left long after the transport, that discrepancy is preserved, not discarded. Clean timelines accept conflict and resolve it with records, not preference. Within 48 hours, the who, where, when is largely settled. The how is left to the lab and the examiner's report, which will lock trajectories, distances, and wound sequencing, each of which can support or contradict explanations offered later in court. If an explanation is that someone was forced, the timeline still has to show a path for coercion that matches the physical record, communications, third-party presence, or evidence of constraint. If the record does not show it, the claim stands alone. The data align cleanly. Sometimes that's where questions begin, but questions still have to land on facts. There is also the community piece, short and practical. Families who live on streets like Mill Dam do not need drama, they need clarity. An isolated designation matters because it tells parents whether to change routines the next morning. Transparency about the timeline, without exposing sensitive details, builds trust across the block. You can feel respect in the way a department protects the process: one scene, one address, one chain of custody. That steadiness honors Josefina, whose last verified movements must be rebuilt with discipline, not guesswork. By hour 72, investigators have compiled a coherent sequence. A domestic dispute escalates inside a cohabited home. Shots are reported. Police respond rapidly. One partner is detained. The victim is transported and later pronounced. The case advances to court with no bond. It is not the length of the timeline that keeps attention. It is the precision of the steps. When a story respects that precision, the audience can track the truth without filler, and the case can stand on its own in front of any judge. From the doorway in, the case moves in straight lines. Investigators treat the Mill Dam Road residence as the only scene, and that decision shapes every choice they make. They map the rooms, mark what changed when EMS carried Josefina Tavares, 40, out of the house, and lock the rest in place. Photography runs wide to tight, then measurement follows. It is not about putting on a show, It is about creating a record that can stand alone months from now when memories have softened. The aim is simple: determine how many shots were fired, where the shooter stood, and whether the room geometry supports or contradicts any explanation offered later. Cartridge casings, if present, are the first easy wins. Their number cannot tell you everything, but it can tell you what is impossible. If the count is more than 1, accidental discharge falls away. If the casings pool in one area, it hints at a stationary shooter. If they scatter across thresholds, it suggests movement through the house. Technicians bag each spent casing separately to preserve fingerprints, trace, or tool marks. They do not assume a match to any weapon until lab work confirms it. The same restraint applies to bullet impacts. Each strike is measured for height and angle so a basic trajectory can be plotted from muzzle to wall, ceiling, or furniture. When these lines converge, they give shape to where a firearm likely sat in space. On soft surfaces, blood tells time and distance in a different way. Analysts avoid speculation and note only what patterns show: direction of travel, interruption marks where a body or object cut through, and whether heavy pooling indicates a collapse point. If fresh attempts at cleanup exist, those are documented without commentary. They are photographs and sample numbers, not arguments. The medical examiner will later connect these room-level observations to wounds, paths, and range estimates. Until then, the scene work stops at what is visible and measurable. That discipline keeps a case from drifting into a narrative that the physical record cannot carry. Distance matters. Close-range indicators, residue on fabric, stippling on skin, belong to the medical side, but the house can still speak. A wall marked by gas or unburned powder near an impact point may support a short muzzle-to-target distance. The absence of that marker pushes the estimate outward. A muzzle pressed against the surface leaves different signs than one held away. None of these details are used here to dramatize. They are quiet facts that either line up with a later claim of self-defense or they do not. In a domestic homicide, the room is often the only neutral witness. The more carefully it is documented, the less weight is placed on conflicting human statements. Investigators also log what is not found. If a firearm is recovered, it is photographed before movement, unloaded safely, and secured for trace and ballistics. If no firearm is recovered at the scene, that absence is not a blank. It is an evidentiary condition that will later be tested against doorbell cameras, cell site windows, and any timeline gaps between shots fired and squad arrival. Missing weapons leave trails, on hands, on clothing, in vehicles, or in the digital moments when someone leaves a room to dispose of evidence. Here, the report does not guess. It simply notes whether a weapon was taken into evidence or listed as outstanding at the time of processing. Hand swabs for possible residue are routine where policy allows and where timelines are tight. If taken, they are taken early, because residue is fragile. Clothing from involved parties is packaged in paper, not plastic, to prevent moisture artifacts. Items that can shift interpretations, like a phone lying face up on a counter showing recent activity, are photographed with screen states preserved, then powered down properly. These are small steps with large consequences. They preserve the difference between a clean fact and a contested memory. The house also gives context for the confrontation that preceded the gunfire. Signs of forced entry, or the lack of them, matter. Door integrity, broken locks, and displaced furniture get treated as facts, not drama. An obvious struggle is one thing, an argument that escalates quickly without wide damage is another. In rooms where rounds traveled, the path of the shots is paired with furniture position to test whether bodies were standing, sitting, or moving. The simplest reconstructions are often the best: a doorway and a line of fire across it, a living room with a single cluster of impacts, a hallway where height and angle make a story unlikely. Good forensics does not declare motives, it narrows the universe of believable explanations. All of this is done with an eye on the clock. The timeline from the previous section defines what forensics should and should not show. If neighbors heard shots at a particular minute and dispatch stamped the call seconds later, there is little room for elaborate staging. If the scene suggests multiple shots within a small radius and short time span, the narrative of a rolling altercation through the house becomes less credible. The best investigations keep these threads together: time, space, and impact, so the eventual legal posture sits on something stronger than opinion. There is a human frame to this work. The care taken at a single address in Wake Forest is not bureaucracy, it is respect for a person who cannot speak to what happened. Precision keeps speculation out and protects the community from rumors that answer easy questions and miss the hard ones. The goal is not to punish a neighborhood with details, it is to make sure the facts that matter survive the wait between September 30th and a courtroom date that will not come for weeks. To understand why this case was framed as domestic from minute one, investigators start where the relationship lives, inside the same address. Records confirm that Josefina Tavares, 40, resided at the Mill Dam Road home and was in an intimate partnership with the adult male detained that night. That single fact, cohabitation, narrows the field. It means access was constant, opportunity required no forced entry, and any conflict that escalated likely did so in familiar rooms rather than in a break-in scenario. The work here isn't about motives, it's about verifiable conditions that shape how evidence is read. Detectives follow a standard set of checks that do not depend on drama. First, prior police contacts tied to the address, calls for noise, disturbance, welfare checks, or domestic incidents. If something exists, it is pulled, timestamped, and compared against neighbors' statements and the night's dispatch log. If the file is clean, that becomes a data point of its own. No documented history does not mean no risk, but it informs how prosecutors and the court weigh future claims. Second, civil records, any protective orders, divorce filings, or custody disputes. Those records, if present, tend to fix patterns of contact and control and will later inform charging decisions. Third, collateral contacts, friends, relatives, or coworkers who can speak to recent stressors without speculation, limited to time and behavior that can be corroborated. In 2025 North Carolina, domestic violence awareness is not an abstract talking point, it is a practical backdrop that agencies consider when triaging a fatal scene. By late September, statewide tallies already pointed to dozens of intimate partner homicides for the year. That context doesn't prove this case, but it does explain the precision you see in Wake Forest: isolate the scene, stabilize both parties, and preserve every physical and digital trace before narratives harden. When the public statement said isolated incident, no ongoing threat, that wasn't minimization, it was a factual boundary that told neighbors the danger wasn't roaming the block. Clarity serves the community and protects the case. Relationship verification also guides the immediate interview plan. Investigators sequence interviews to avoid cross-contamination: neighbors first, then close contacts, then anyone who had direct interaction with the couple on September 30th. The questions are narrow on purpose. When did you last see or speak with Josefina? What was her demeanor? Did she express fear or intent to leave? Did you observe fresh injuries or property damage in prior days? Answers get weighted only when two things happen: when a statement lines up with a timestamp, and when it aligns with something in the house that can be photographed or measured. A remark about constant arguing is background. A text message with a time and content that match the hour of the shots becomes part of the chain. What sits underneath this chapter is the legal reality of intimate partner cases. Cohabitation changes what a jury expects to see. There may be no broken lock, no pry marks, and no foreign DNA at an entry point because none were needed to cross the threshold. That doesn't excuse anything. It defines the kind of proof that matters: trajectory, distance, injury pattern, and post-incident behavior. If an explanation later claims a sudden threat, investigators will test whether the room supports rapid, defensive fire or a contained cluster inconsistent with retreat. If an explanation claims coercion by an outside party, the same relationship checks and camera canvas will either show an outsider in the window or they won't. In a domestic frame, the absence of third-party movement often speaks loudest. The human part of this is simple and sober. Josefina wasn't a headline, she was a resident with a routine. Respect means getting every label right and resisting the urge to fill gaps with theories. It also means acknowledging the common red flags without staging a lecture. People leave and come back, money gets tight, arguments flare, loved ones notice, but none of that is proof until tied to evidence. Good storytelling in a true crime report mirrors good casework. It keeps the audience oriented to what can be shown and doesn't spend their attention on what can't. In towns like Wake Forest, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community, so precision matters. This is why the first court appearance, scheduled the day after the shooting, matters less for sound bites and more for process. Early claims, any claims, are logged, not judged. The question for investigators is always the same: do the room geometry, the medical findings, and the timeline support or contradict what was said in court? That is why you haven't heard lengthy speculation here. The story needs to hold up on replay months later, when memories fade and only the record stands. There's also a viewer-facing lesson we can state without preaching. If you or someone you know is living in a situation where arguments escalate, early documentation saves lives and clarifies cases. In the systems that handle these incidents, dispatch logs, hospital records, civil filings, quiet paperwork becomes the backbone of the truth. That's not dramatic, but it is how justice holds. The case remains one scene, one victim, one detained partner, and a line of dates that stops at October 25, 2025. Nothing here jumps ahead of the record. The next section will move from context to custody and charging decisions, what was said in the courtroom and how those statements are weighed against the evidence gathered so far. The transition from scene to courtroom in Wake Forest moved fast because the facts demanded speed. By the end of September 30th, 2025, one adult male, 44, identified by investigators as the victim's partner and co-resident, was in police custody tied to the shooting inside the Mill Dam Road home. The night ended with him held without bond while evidence from the residence was preserved and logged. That decision wasn't rhetorical. It reflected the nature of the injury, the domestic classification, and the need to keep the chain of custody clean. The following morning, October 1st, the case shifted from street to bench. First appearances in North Carolina are brief but consequential. The court confirms the charge on the record, advises rights, assigns counsel when needed, and sets the next date. In this case, a court-appointed defense attorney was authorized. Through an interpreter, the detained partner made a single statement that would echo through the news cycle: "I was forced to do it." It's a quote, not a finding. In a domestic homicide, claims like coercion or compulsion get logged the same way any other assertion does, noted verbatim, preserved, and measured against physical evidence, digital traces, and sequence. Emotion doesn't get to steer the process, the record does. Prosecutors framed the charging posture in simple terms. A woman, Josefina Tavares, 40, was shot multiple times inside the home she shared with the detained partner. She was transported and later pronounced. The residence showed no sign of a stranger crossing the threshold, and there was no public danger beyond that address. That is the complete public picture as of October 1st. What prosecutors did not do was overpromise about lab returns, trajectory specifics, or device logs not yet disclosed. The standard is to protect the integrity of testing and to avoid giving any witness, friendly or hostile, room to tailor stories around unpublicized facts. The force to do it line matters only to the extent the case can test it. Investigators will ask whether any third party appears in the narrow window around the shots, on doorbell cameras, and vehicle movement near the house, or in communications. They'll examine whether the geometry inside the home supports a scenario where a gun was fired under immediate compulsion. In court, compulsion isn't a feeling, it's a condition that leaves footprints, threat messages, presence data, or at minimum, an external actor who intersects the timeline. If the record shows none of that, the statement remains just that, a statement that doesn't change the physical facts. Bond decisions in fatal domestic shootings often trend conservative, and this case was no exception. Detention without bond held, and the calendar moved forward with the next setting marked for October 22, 2025. That date is procedural, not predictive. Between the first appearance and the next hearing, the state continues to assemble admissible pieces, confirm who fired, establish distance and direction, reconcile witness clocks with dispatch logs, and ensure that every item in and out of the property has a signature and a timestamp. The defense, in turn, will lock mode and theory, compulsion, self-defense, accident, or something else. But as of October 25th, there is no adjudication, only a charged case moving through the system. This is the part of true crime that doesn't chase dramatic turns. It follows the structure that protects the living and respects the dead. The court doesn't speculate, and neither should we. The reason the story stays coherent is because it stays close to the verified. One scene at Mill Dam Road near Winter Jasmine Lane, one victim, one detained partner, one domestically framed incident, and a short timeline that starts with gunfire and ends, for now, with a defendant held without bond. Clarity isn't a style choice, it's how the truth survives into trial. Once the first appearance wrapped on October 1st, the center of gravity moved from the courtroom back to the evidence lockers and the lab queue. The record had to answer a narrow question: does anything in the science support a person being forced to fire inside the Mill Dam Road home on September 30th, 2025? That is not about tone or sympathy. It's about measurable facts that either corroborate or contradict a coercion scenario. Technicians prioritized items that degrade fast. Clothing from everyone involved was packaged dry and logged for possible residue. If a weapon was recovered, it went out for 2 tracks of testing, tool marks to compare any spent casings to that specific firearm, and DNA/contact swabs on grip, slide, and magazine surfaces. Tool marks are straightforward. Ejector marks and breech face signatures act like a fingerprint for the gun. If casings at the scene all match one firearm, the number of shots and the location of the casings can be paired with room diagrams to map shooter position. That matters because coercion claims often imply movement, interference, or an external actor close enough to direct the trigger. A tight casing cluster where a shooter likely stood still tells a different story than a chaotic path. From the medical side, the examiner's early guidance focuses the room work without spilling privileged details. Range estimates, wound paths, and sequencing, first, second, third, let detectives check whether shots came in a flurry from a fixed point or in a staggered pattern consistent with struggle. In a compulsion scenario, analysts look for evidence of proximity or physical constraint, injuries on hands or wrists that suggest someone else's controlling grip, transfer patterns that place a third party within inches at the crucial moments, or damage to fixtures that indicate bodies collided. If those markers are absent, it doesn't end the inquiry, but it narrows how coercion could have happened. The digital lane runs alongside the lab work. Doorbell and exterior cameras on the block are pulled for the 10-minute window bracketing the gunfire. Investigators are not hunting for drama, they are looking for the basic movements that would put a third person at the threshold or in the driveway. A compulsion theory loses oxygen if no one else appears near the house before or after the shots. Phones are treated the same way. If a consenting search or a warrant is in hand, the first pass is simple: presence data, recent calls, messages, and whether any device moved off the property at a time that conflicts with the locked timeline. Presence is not guilt, but absence can be persuasive when a story requires an outsider who never shows up on any lens or signal. Hands and face testing, where policy allows, round out the early phase. If swabs are taken promptly, residue patterns can support or weaken statements about who handled the firearm and at what range. Positive findings on one person and clean results on others may be consistent with a single shooter. A mix of results can mean shared handling or post-incident contact. The point is not to convict in a lab. It's to build a scaffold that later testimony cannot easily bend. By the end of this phase, investigators expect 3 lines to converge: scene geometry, medical sequencing, and external movement. If they align, the case narrative firms up. If they diverge, the team goes back to doorways, angles, and clocks to find the miss. That's the discipline that keeps a domestic shooting from turning into 2 different stories. You won't hear a new ending here because there isn't one as of October 25th, 2025. There is only a charged case, 1 victim, 1 detained partner, and a record that is getting harder to argue with as more pieces lock into place. The human note is brief but real. Science is not cold when it gives a family clarity. It's steady. It removes guesswork. It spares a neighborhood needless speculation. In a town like Wake Forest, that matters as much as any headline. By the close of October 1st, 2025, Wake Forest authorities put names on the record. The victim is Josefina Tavares, 40. The detained partner is Hairston Jose Urania Morales, 44. The location never changed, the residence on Mill Dam Road near Winter Jasmine Lane. The legal posture is plain and unchanged through October 25, 2025. Murder charge, held without bond, first appearance completed, next setting marked for October 22, 2025. In court, Urania Morales, through an interpreter, said, "I was forced to do it." Investigators treated that as a claim to be tested against the timeline and the physical record gathered inside the home. No ruling has resolved that claim, the case remains active. This closing step is about alignment, not retelling. The municipal update and local reporting match on the essentials: one scene, domestic context, a rapid response window, and a single suspect in custody. There's no second address, no parallel storyline, and no alternate ending. The facts sit where they started, inside the house Josefina shared with the man now charged in her death. That continuity matters because it preserves clarity for viewers and integrity for court. It also matters for a neighborhood that woke up to sirens and found out a homicide happened on their block. When police said domestic and isolated, it wasn't to soften the blow, it was to describe a boundary the evidence supported. That boundary keeps rumor out and lets families return to routine without guessing if danger is still moving through their streets. In towns like Wake Forest, precision is a kind of respect, for the public and for the person who can't speak anymore. There's a human truth here that doesn't need drama to land. Intimate partner violence hides in plain sight. It can live behind a familiar door, around a dinner table, or in the silence after an argument. If something in your life, or in a friend's, tracks with escalation, document it and reach out early. In the United States, confidential help is available. Using those options is not weakness, it's planning. Paper trails, timestamps, and messages don't just help cases, sometimes they prevent them. As we close, we leave the story exactly where the record leaves it. Josefina Tavares is the victim. Hairston Jose Urania Morales is charged and detained without bond. The case is moving forward in North Carolina, and no court has decided the outcome as of October 25, 2025. Justice is slow by design. That pace protects truth, even when it tests patience. Tonight's case reminded me why facts matter. I'm not here to sensationalize a family's worst day. I'm here to help you read the signs early, document what's real, and choose safety before a crisis chooses you. If this story moved you, tell me what part hit hardest, or what you would have done differently. If it didn't, say why. Your pushback makes these reports better. Drop where you're watching from so we can build this community of careful listeners. And if you want more clear, human true crime reporting, please subscribe and stay with us.